Thank you. Welcome everyone to our webinar today. Just wanted to let you know that if you're listening to the live webinar on October 10th, 2018 and want to earn ASHA CEUs for this course, be sure to attend the entire 1-hour session. The handout and all the forms you need to complete to obtain CE credit were emailed to you in the reminder email. Mail the ASHA participant form and the evaluation form to the address shown at the bottom of the slide. The forms have to be postmarked no later than October 17, 2018. If you happen to have more than one person at your location, be sure to download the attendance sheet and have each person requesting CEU sign the sheet and complete the ASHA participant form and the evaluation form. There are no CEUs offered for the recording of this session that's available on the Pearson website. In addition, if you have multiple people at your site, if you wouldn't mind putting in the chat box the number of people at your location. If you're the only person there, you don't need to submit an attendance form, and you don't need to let us know that you're the only one there. Now that all that's done, we can get on with our program. It's now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Gloria McCoo, who's conducting our presentation today.
Okay, thank you, Nancy, and welcome everybody, and wherever you are in the country, morning or afternoon. I hope you are here for this webinar, which we hope will be instructive and informative. We want to go beyond vocabulary scores today. And when we think about the importance of vocabulary, and we think about that in context of the school setting, we think about children who might be struggling with content demands in the classroom, whether you're thinking with learning to read or conceivably reading to learn in science and social studies, for example. Sometimes children are struggling with the demands in the classroom because of weaknesses in either vocabulary comprehension, receptive vocabulary, or conceivably expressive vocabulary. So our webinar today will provide information about interpreting scores from the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, the 5th edition, and the Expressive Vocabulary Test, 3rd edition. And we want to use some case study information to illustrate the interpretive process. Before I look at the objectives or the learner outcomes for today, there is a disclosure that we must provide. The publisher of the PPVT-5 and the EVT-3 is Pearson Clinical Assessment, and I am an employee of Pearson. In addition to that financial disclosure, there is no relevant, non-financial information that I need to disclose today. The content of this webinar will focus primarily on the PPVT-5 and EVT-3, and we're not going to reference any similar assessments during this presentation. In terms of the learner outcomes, and all of these slides are included in the handout, which we hope that you received with a reminder email earlier today. In terms of the learner outcomes, what we'd like you to be able to do at the end of this webinar is to identify or list 3 reasons for assessing vocabulary. We're going to spend the bulk of our time today comparing the acquisition of receptive and expressive vocabulary. And then we'll end our hour together by describing how results from PPVT-5 and EVT-3 are used to plan intervention, which from my perspective, and I'm sure from yours as well, is really the important purpose for which we conduct assessment in the first place, to identify what the child needs and what we can do to facilitate development of, in this case, vocabulary. In terms of the agenda, we're going to spend about 15 minutes talking about the importance of assessing vocabulary, about 20 minutes comparing receptive and expressive vocabulary acquisition, and then 15 minutes looking at the case study where we want to focus on the integration of the assessment data and linking those data to intervention. And then we'll have time for questions and answers at the end. So let's get started. And the first part of what I'm going to describe here, the importance of assessing vocabulary, If you were able to attend the first webinar that we presented in September on the PPVT-5 and EVT-3, then we covered some of this information, and I'm going to use this information as a review to establish the foundation for our topic today. Toward the end of my presentation, I do have a link to the recording of that webinar just in case you weren't able to attend that one. So let me get started then by thinking about vocabulary in relation to reading comprehension. So when we think about vocabulary and reading and comprehension, certainly I think the relationship between the two has been recognized for decades. So you think about other skills and abilities like verbal reasoning, certainly understanding syntax as being important for comprehension, but vocabulary, that semantic code, is absolutely linked directly to comprehension. So vocabulary size, if you will, is a major correlate of comprehension. Now, one of the ways that we learn the meaning of new words really is by encountering those new words in text. And sometimes we need to use context to infer the meaning of some of the new words that we encounter. So if you think about vocabulary, really I can expand my vocabulary through reading. So when you think about comprehension and vocabulary, you certainly recognize that the two are correlated, but you also think about the two as having this reciprocal relationship. So what happens is that children in our schools who come to school with a limited vocabulary, what we notice is that they struggle to achieve comprehension. Now, unfortunately, the side effect of struggling with comprehension might be frustration, right? Frustration related to reading. So instead of that child continuing to read, which in turn would continue to grow his or her vocabulary, what we find is that the child doesn't engage in reading, and therefore vocabulary development stagnates. So when you think about the reciprocal relationship between comprehension and vocabulary, think about vocabulary really affecting how well an individual can read. But you also think about the fact that the more I comprehend, the more comfortable I feel with reading, the more I am likely to read, therefore the more my vocabulary is likely to develop. In contrast, struggling readers will not read as much, and therefore their vocabulary development will stagnate. And I'm sure you recognize this as the Matthew effect, which was originally identified in the early 1980s. But in addition to the relationship between vocabulary and reading comprehension, vocabulary may also contribute to basic reading when you think about reading decoding. So when you think about early reading, when young children who have large speaking vocabularies, large oral vocabularies, they may be better able to analyze when you think about the representations of sounds. Certainly in their speaking vocabularies, they're able to identify the sounds or the phonemes associated with words that they can say. But what we find is that children with large speaking vocabularies may be better able to analyze the representation of the sounds within a written word. So you think about the analysis and the synthesis, the segmenting, and then the blending. So effectively what you find is that when a child hears the word, the child pretty much is able to repeat the word and may be able to visualize the symbols associated with that sound. So vocabulary also facilitates reading decoding. Now, if you think about reading comprehension, reading decoding, and vocabulary, what you find is that vocabulary really is the component that bridges phonics or word level processes, or basic reading, if you will, and then cognitive processes such as comprehension. So when you think about comprehension, really comprehension requires certainly the ability to integrate the visual word form, the orthographic code, with the verbal word form, the phonological code, but often what helps children crack the code is really the semantic word form, right? The morphology, the morphological, the meaningful information that is presented by morphological components and by word meaning. So you think about vocabulary as really forming the bridge between phonics, the ability to decode words, and then the ability to understand words in context. Now, certainly vocabulary is important in schools. We understand vocabulary is important when we think about reading comprehension, when we think about reading decoding. We also understand that once children have learned to read, once children are able to name words and understand their meaning, what we really want them to be able to do is to use that ability to read in order to acquire knowledge in different contexts. So when you think about reading to learn, that theoretically would be the basis of our curricula, maybe starting towards the end of third grade, you're thinking about certainly vocabulary size being important for science, for social studies, for math problem solving. So certainly vocabulary is really important when we think about learning to read and when we think about reading to learn. But vocabulary, as I mentioned, really is the component that bridges those word-level processes and those cognitive processes. So I want to say a few words now about vocabulary and its relation to the ability to think, to reason, and to solve problems when you think about verbal ability, for example. So when you think about vocabulary in relation to verbal ability, in relation to cognitive ability, vocabulary knowledge certainly represents the number of words, the number of word meanings that an individual has learned, possibly through interactions in the home, through interactions in the school, through interactions in other environments that the child or the individual navigates. Now, what we know when we look at measures of intelligence is that probably starting in 1916, when the Stanford-Binet, one of the first measures of intelligence in this country, when the Stanford-Binet was published, we find that most measures of broad intelligence include some type of vocabulary subtest. So the Cattell-Horn-Carroll model of cognitive abilities, which is based on probably an amalgamation of hundreds of research studies, includes as one of its core abilities this one right here, crystallized ability. And crystallized ability really refers to the knowledge that I have acquired through interactions in my culture, whether you're thinking my interactions in school, in home, and other areas. So what do I know, declarative knowledge, and what do I know about how to perform certain things? So when you think about procedural knowledge, think, for example, I think it makes sense to me most often when I think about math and I think about being able to subtract in the base 10 number system. Do I know exactly what that procedure is in order to get to the correct response? But when you think about crystallized ability, you're thinking about abilities that really have to do with acquired knowledge. Now, one of the things that I want to say about crystallized ability is that, and this is something that is unique about this one compared to some of the others like fluid reasoning, maybe short-term memory, long-term memory, and so on. One of the unique features of crystallized ability is that it certainly focuses or it measures acquired knowledge. So when you think about lexical knowledge and general information, but it also assesses it also requires a collection of processing abilities. So you think about oral production and fluency, for example. You think about listening ability. Now, as I say those words, I hope that one of the things that you hear when you think about our disciplines, for example, often the speech-language pathologist, if a child is referred for comprehensive psychoeducational evaluation, often the speech-language pathologist would be the professional who would provide the information about the child's oral production and fluency, about the child's listening ability. The school psychologist might be the one who would provide information on maybe the child's general knowledge, the child's lexical knowledge, maybe his or her knowledge of culture. So again, when you think about working with children in schools, it's really important for us to think about the different professionals who are involved, and the collaboration, I think, makes the result for the child much more effective. So when you think about information on vocabulary then, I want you to think about why you would need that information, why you would maybe go about collecting that information in the first place. Maybe because we have some indication in the classroom that vocabulary is impaired, and maybe that might be a symptom of a possible language disorder. Maybe we need to measure semantic development, especially among non-readers, and we recognize that vocabulary provides information about one aspect of semantic development. But perhaps most importantly, what we really want to be able to do is identify the child's needs so that we can target interventions to facilitate the development of vocabulary. But you also think about vocabulary in relation to academic content. Maybe the child is struggling with reading, but the basis for the reading difficulties is based in language. Or maybe you're working with a child who's an English language learner, and we want to be able to identify the child's level of English vocabulary. Or maybe we want to think about the child's response, and when you think about presenting vocabulary measures, is the child's performance different when we think about recognition vocabulary versus production vocabulary? So there are a number of different reasons for assessing vocabulary, and these are probably a few of those reasons. So one of the things that I want to do now to transition is to think about recognition vocabulary and production vocabulary. So when you think about score differences between receptive and expressive vocabulary, we all know that there are many factors that might explain differential performance when we think about receptive and expressive vocabulary. And certainly these factors might include vocabulary development. Maybe we need to think about vocabulary by part of speech. Maybe a child is able to more effectively identify nouns when the child when the items are presented in a recognition format versus a production format. Maybe I want to consider individual differences in vocabulary development, but maybe the explanation lies in the concept, breadth and depth of vocabulary. And then what about vocabulary development of bilingual children? Is that something that I need to consider when I am analyzing differential performance when I think about receptive and expressive vocabulary? And then another factor, and I'll talk about each of these here in turn, one of the factors that I think is really important and that often does help us to advance our hypotheses is really looking at the characteristics of the assessment instrument. So thinking about how this particular instrument assesses whatever the construct of interest might be, in this case, vocabulary, receptive and expressive. So let me say a few words about receptive and expressive development or semantic development. When you think about vocabulary milestones, and that information is presented in a 2001 textbook, Language Disorders from Infancy Through Adolescence. When you look at these vocabulary milestones, and pretty much you think about children who start off maybe by about a year being able to understand between 3 words and 50 words, and certainly most of the words in their vocabulary at that point relate to their environment, typically the home environment. So you're thinking especially about them being able to label names. Between 12 and 18 months, you notice the average expressive vocabulary size between 50 and 100 words in specific types of words. You're thinking about words for agent, action, objects, location, possession, rejection, and so on. And then by the time the child gets to be about 3 years old, theoretically when the child is starting maybe a preschool program, the child is able to understand different language concepts. So you're thinking about spatial concepts, temporal concepts. Certainly there are color words that will allow them to label their environment. They also are able to understand the words for basic shapes and possibly making the transition from language to literacy. They understand the letter names. They understand sounds. They might be able by 4.5 years to be able to associate those symbols with different sounds. And then when you think about when children start school with an average expressive vocabulary size about 5,000 words, what we find is that the vocabulary development advances rapidly because the school introduces new words that children typically don't encounter in conversation. So between 7 and 12 years, what we find is that their vocabulary sizes really increase because of the information provided through reading. And then, of course, when you think about children graduating high school, what is the average vocabulary size of the high school graduate? One of the things that I want to point out certainly is this is information that's pulled from a specific textbook. But one of the things that we all know is that there is tremendous variability when we think about these vocabulary milestones. And certainly some students who are graduating high school will have an average vocabulary size that certainly exceeds 10,000 words, and we want to make sure that we keep in mind that variability. But one of the things that I wanted to illustrate in this section is really when you think about comparing vocabulary development, receptive and expressive, is that really for the most part, what we find, and Virginia Berninger talks about this a lot, that we learn language first by ear and then by mouth. And what you notice is that for the average 16-month-old, the receptive vocabulary might be between 100 and 200 words. The expressive vocabulary might be approximately 50 words. By about 6 years old, you notice the average size for receptive compared to the average size for receptive. So certainly keep in mind that theoretically, developmentally, the recognition receptive vocabulary tends to develop before the expressive vocabulary, so that we'll see a child's ability to understand many more words than he or she actually produces. One of the other things that we want to keep in mind when we're trying to understand differences in performance when we think about receptive and expressive is really looking at the part of speech that is being assessed by different items. So when we think about vocabulary development, what we notice is that the first words that children learn, most of the first words children learn are nouns. And this makes sense because what they're doing is they're learning to label their environment. And then you notice about 10% would be verbs, 10% adjectives, and 10% function words. But once productive vocabulary exceeds 600 words, still you notice that about 40% of those words would be nouns, and then about 25% would be verbs and adjectives, 15% would be function words. Why is this information important? Because when you are analyzing a child's performance, say on the PPVT-5 and EVT-3, if a child is performing much better on nouns than on some of those other parts of speech, maybe that gives us some information about where we want to target or interventions. I wanted to take a look at some data to a question was, can you give an example of a function word? An example of a function word would be like if I ask you, do you live here? Then effectively I could say, you live here, and you would understand exactly what I'm asking. So the word do really provides some function, but it's not essential to communicating the meaning. And I'm sure that my colleagues, my speech language colleagues, can give you a much better answer on that one than I just did. Okay, so the other thing that I wanted to do was to think about receptive expressive differences and whether or not we have data to kind of maybe support the hypothesis that children tend to develop receptive language before expressive language. Now, one of the things that I did to kind of come up with some numbers here is I looked at the information from the Cell 5, the normative sample. And one of the things that I found there, when you look at the normative sample and we analyze, we compare performance on receptive to performance on expressive, for about 5% of the individuals in our normative sample, there were no differences between the receptive language index and the expressive language index. But for about 48%, the score on receptive language was higher than the score on expressive language, but notice that approximately the same percentage, the score for expressive language was higher than the score for expressive language. So it is possible that even though we tend to learn language first by ear, that for some children their performance might be better on expressive language. But one of the things that I wanted to show you here is when we look at the normative sample, what we find is that the percentage of individuals within the normative sample with a different score of 10 or more standard score points, 17.5% had a higher receptive score, 17.9% had a higher expressive language index score. But when we look at individuals who were subsequently classified with a language disorder, notice that the majority of these children actually had a higher receptive than expressive language score. About 9% had a higher score on the expressive language index. So again, you want to keep this information in mind when you're analyzing a child's performance on the PPVT-5 and EVT-3. Okay. Okay, so when you say no difference, does that mean within 15 points? What it means is that the difference was not statistically significant, and when I get to my case study, I will show you how we establish that statistical significance. But the other thing you want to consider when you're analyzing performance on a measure of receptive vocabulary compared to a measure of expressive vocabulary is you definitely want to keep in mind individual differences in vocabulary development, right? So when you think about individual differences in vocabulary development, certainly that's where the variability comes in, as I referred to that variability earlier. And certainly variability comes from individual factors, but variability also comes from contextual factors. So when you think about individual characteristics, for example, maybe the age at which I started speaking, for example, maybe I started speaking at a later age than would be considered developmentally appropriate. Maybe there were other indications that my language development was a little slower than you would expect given your knowledge of developmental milestones. But effectively, you want to think about different contextual factors that might influence the development of language. And some of those factors certainly are related to the home. Some of them are related to the school. We've talked about the fact that children start to learn language through interactions in the home, and that once children enter school, we notice that their vocabulary, there's this explosion in terms of vocabulary because of all of the words that they're learning through their exposure to text. But the home is certainly really important when you think about the individual differences in vocabulary development. And certainly one of the studies that we always have to mention when we think about individual differences in vocabulary development related to home factors is that study by Betty Hart and Todd Risley. And we mentioned that study when we looked at that when we presented the first webinar in September. But effectively what Betty Hart and Todd Risley found was that in comparison to highly educated middle-class parents, less educated parents from low socioeconomic levels, they tended to use a reduced number of words, and they tended to use a reduced variety of words when they were directing speech to the child. And this, in turn, reduced the child's vocabularies so that when children from these different socioeconomic levels entered school, there was this word gap, this gap between children from the higher professional families and children from wealthier families. So that word gap certainly is important, and this highlights the importance of home factors, certainly. Now, one of the things that Burko and Gleason point out, and I think it's really important to mention, is that over time, even though children will start to learn their words in the home, their vocabulary knowledge expands beyond the home and the caregiver to include a variety of sources, including certainly the classroom environment, interactions with peers, whatever their exposure would be to reading, maybe to other media like watching different programs on TV. So I think although the reality is that many students who live in poor communities and who might be attending schools that don't have the resources like other schools, although those students may know significantly fewer words than more privileged students, it's important to keep in mind that socioeconomic conditions per se are not barriers to advanced vocabulary. But it's also important for us to keep in mind that when we provide optimal environmental conditions both at home and at school, children can achieve adequate vocabulary sizes, and often in one or more languages. So I want you to keep that in mind when we think about the actual case study data that we'll look at here in a minute. Okay. The other factor that we want to consider, and this is one that Dr. Williams, the author of the EVT-3, references all the time in her webinars, is we definitely want to take a look at the breadth and depth of the child's vocabulary knowledge. So when you think about vocabulary breadth, think about the number of words that the child knows. And of course, the number of words that a child knows is really enhanced when he or she can think about words in the context of families. So for example, if I know the word drive, then I will have some indication of the meaning of the word driver, of the word driving, of the word drives, for example. So think about being able to expand one's vocabulary size when we think about word families. But when you think about vocabulary depth, what you're thinking about is really language. In what context, when when I think about language, from what component of language do I have knowledge of a certain word? For example, when I think about phonology, do I understand the sound and the spelling of the word? When I think about morphology, do I understand the morphological structure of the word? What about the types of sentences in which it can occur when I think about syntax? And when I think about multiple meanings, do I know multiple meanings for that word, for example? So when I think about the word bitter, for example, maybe I think about the food that I was eating that was really bitter. I think about a really bitter divorce or custody battle. I think about the bitter cold, for example, up in Minnesota. So you think about the multiple meanings and the word associations, and I always think about that in the context of semantics. And then finally, do I understand the situations in which it would be appropriate to use that word? And then I think about that in terms of language. I think about that as pragmatics. And then, of course, when you think about the spelling bees, one of the things that a child often asks when he or she is trying to get some direction, well, what is the origin of the word and what is the meaning of the word? So when you think about vocabulary depth, some children may know a large number of words, but they may know the words at a really surface level. So being able to analyze breadth and depth of vocabulary knowledge is important as well. And then when you think about vocabulary development of bilingual children, if you're working with a child who speaks more than one language, certainly you want to make sure that you understand the vocabulary development of bilingual children. Now, one of the things that I want to say here, and this is information that comes from a 2018 textbook, that Burko and Gleason textbook, is that the vocabularies of bilingual children develop at the same rate as vocabularies of monolingual children when both their languages are taken into account. And that is something that is really important, and it's actually something that I think test developers pay a lot of attention to because this has tremendous implications for assessment, right? So when you think about the implications of this for assessment, maybe certain things might come to your mind. We want to make sure that we can take both languages into account when we are assessing and describing the vocabulary size of a bilingual child. So maybe what we need to think about as examiners or clinicians is how to score responses, or how does that particular assessment instrument instruct us to score responses that the child might provide in a different language. And in addition, how are we instructed to score dialectal or regional responses that do not match the target response that we capture in the manual and on the record form? So the implications for assessment really have to do with making sure that we have a way to capture responses that the child might provide in a different language. And I think this answers the question that is coming in now. Think about, does the tool allow you to give credit for responses that may not be in English, but that actually communicate understanding of the concept? And then also maybe, and this is something I think that speech language pathologists do, because most of the standardized tools actually facilitate that, is you think about if a child is providing a response and it's obvious that the response is maybe it doesn't sound right because of an error of articulation, that we are able to give credit for that. So because of these implications, one of the things that the development team for the EVT-3 did was really to consult with experts who are familiar with dialectal variations, experts in a number of countries, including the U.S. But the other other thing that we do, and you want to make sure that you review the examiner's manual for the EVT-3 to see whether or not you can score responses as correct responses that the child provides in another language, and also how you might be able to score dialectal or regional responses that do not match the target. So for example, the one that I mentioned before, as long as the response is intelligible and we know that the error is one of pronunciation or articulation, for example, free for 3, then we give credit for that response. Maybe the child provides a response in Spanish as opposed to English. As long as we understand the correctness of that response, we will give credit for that response. Maybe if the child provides a slang term, for example, copter for helicopter, you give credit. The child provides a diminutive, birdie for bird, for example. So again, you want to make sure you review the examiner's manual for guidance on how you could score as correct responses that might be provided in another language or responses that might be dialectal or regional variations of the target response. And then also in the manual, we have responses that would not be scored as incorrect. And I think this one makes sense, a response that doesn't match the pictured context. For example, bonnet for hat. In this example, bonnet can be a synonym for hat, but the hat that we're picturing is not a bonnet. And sometimes a child might provide a response that is too broad for the pictured content. So again, how do you account for those implications? We want to make sure that whatever tool we're using will allow us to capture responses in different languages and will allow us to analyze and score as either correct or incorrect responses that are provided in that other language or might be a dialectal variation. Now, most of you are SLPs, so I'm sure you are familiar with where you can find information about how to score responses that do not match the target. Certainly go to asha.org and search dialect and assessment. We included some of those here for you on these 2 slides. Okay. Now, I've talked about vocabulary development, breadth and depth of vocabulary. You want to make sure that you consider vocabulary development of bilingual children. But another important factor that we want to consider when we're comparing receptive and expressive vocabulary scores would be the characteristics of the assessment instrument. Because often I think the characteristics of the instrument really will help us to understand maybe which component of the task, which task demand actually facilitated performance, and maybe which task demand led to a relatively lower performance. So when you think about the PPVT, for example, PPVT-5, all of the items consist of 2 parts. So there is a stimulus word, which the clinician will speak, and there is an array of 4 pictures. So I always think about what is the input for the child. The child is going to hear the word, then the child is going to be looking at an array of 4 pictures, and one of these pictures will depict that stimulus word, and the other 3 will be distractors. And the distractors are typically they're really designed to differentiate between the child who really knows the meaning of that stimulus word compared to the child who might be unsure and who therefore might be guessing. So those distractors really tend to be appealing choices so that they do function to distract the child if he or she is not completely sure of the meaning of the word. So you want to think about the input demand. You want to think about the output demand. Now, the way that the child is going to respond or is going to identify his or her response is either by pointing, maybe the child shows in some other way, or there is also one where we ask the child to actually tell in case the child child has some motor impairments that would prevent the child from pointing to. But one of the things that I want you to notice when you think about the characteristics of the assessment instrument is really that you are thinking about recognition vocabulary. Is the child able to recognize among those four words among those four pictures, the picture that represents that target word, compared to the EVT-3, where the examiner is showing a picture and asking something about the picture. So you're thinking about, again, the input. The child is going to be looking, the child is going to be listening, and the child must respond with one word. So in response to what the child hears and what the child sees, the child then has to go to his or her long-term memory, retrieve from long-term memory the one word that provides an acceptable label for the picture. Some of the items require a label for a picture. Some of the items require the child to answer a specific question about the picture. Some of the items ask the child to provide a synonym for a word. Regardless of the type of item, the expectation is that the child will be able to retrieve from long-term memory quickly the label that would respond to that particular question. So you think in this one, PPVT, in essence, as the pictures providing a cue to the child's recall, EVT, where the child has to engage in free recall, you think about word retrieval. So if you have a child where the score for receptive is higher than expressive, what are your hypotheses about why that might be? Well, as I mentioned when I looked at characteristics of the PPVT, well, if you're good at using partial knowledge of the meanings of words, you have four pictures, so there's a 25% chance that you can get it right by guessing alone. But if you can use partial knowledge to identify, oh, I know this one is definitely not right, this one is not right, and then you have maybe a bigger chance of getting it right. So children who are good at using partial knowledge of the meanings of words to rule out distractors really perform better on PPVT than they do on EVT. Another reason that a child might perform better on PPVT than EVT is related to the demand for the EVT, where the EVT requires more word finding or word retrieval than PPVT, and it could be that performance on EVT is affected by a weakness in word retrieval. Another hypothesis might be the expressive demand. The child might be reluctant to speak. I think behavioral observations often could inform your interpretation related to this hypothesis. Was the child engaged in speaking before you started the test, for example? And then experiential background also sometimes can explain the differential performance when you think about receptive being higher than expressive. But what if the opposite was the case? What if expressive is better than receptive? What might be your hypotheses as to why the score on the EVT-3 might be higher, significantly higher than the score on the PPVT-5? So if you would type your ideas into the chat box here, and then I will see what you're thinking. Okay. So processing, attention issues, fatigue, okay, word recall, okay, attention. Okay. Attention, I think, is a really important one because when you think about the PPVT, for example, attention is required for sure, but certainly on the EVT, we expect the child to process many more words than we do on the PPVT in order to understand where to search in his or her long-term memory stores. So certainly attention is a really important one. Impulsivity, anxiety, maybe they've learned syntax, maybe the child attends when he's more invested, and certainly that is the case as tasks really require more cognitive energy. Some children become much more engaged. So difficulty with visual discrimination, low cognition. So a number of factors can explain the differential performance where the score on expressive is higher than receptive, and pretty much all of the ones that I have here are among the ones that you're capturing. But again, you want to think about all of those hypotheses as you start thinking about why this child might have performed the way he or she did. And once we understand that why, we pretty much will be more effective in identifying interventions to target his or her needs. So I want to take a look at maybe some data for this 9-year-old student who is in grade 4 and who was referred for comprehensive psychoeducational evaluation because she was struggling with academic subjects. Now, one of the things that I like to think about right away when I get a referral is this child is in grade 4. The curriculum has transitioned from learning to read to reading to learn. She's struggling with math problem solving, which is the focus of the curriculum now. She's struggling with science and social studies in addition to struggling with reading. So again, you're thinking about the demands of the curriculum as you're starting to consider conceivably which components you're going to assess. But let's say that we have data on vocabulary. One of the things that we want to think about is the interpretation of our data. And as I mentioned, I am pulling out the data for vocabulary from a broader psychoeducational evaluation that certainly included information on intelligence and achievement as well. So when you think about the interpretation of the results, you think about the quantitative interpretation, but often I believe that the qualitative interpretation is really what will link us directly to the interventions. So when you think about the quantitative interpretation, and you have the raw score, for example, for this child whose age is 9 years, 11 months, a standard score of 101, which exceeds the scores, equals or exceeds the scores of approximately 53% of others her age in the normative sample. You can also generate your range of scores, certainly the normal curve equivalent, the stay 9, as well as the test age equivalent and the growth scale value. For our discussion, I'm going to focus on the standard score, which is right within the average range, mean of 100, standard deviation 15. So when you think about recognition vocabulary within the average range. Compare that to production vocabulary, expressive vocabulary measured by the EVT-3. Notice the standard score here of 80, which equals or exceeds the scores of approximately 9% of others her age. So you notice that there is a 21-point difference between the PPVT-5 and the EVT-3. And what I really want to know is that 21-point difference significant? Do I need to consider that difference when I make recommendations for treatment? And you can compare the two scores by calculating the difference. And then the way that you determine, and that was a question that came in earlier, the way that you determine whether or not that difference is statistically significant is by comparing this difference score to this critical value. In this case, we found the critical value at the 0.05 level. Any difference score that equals or exceeds the critical value would indicate that that difference score is statistically significant, which means that it's a real difference. It's not a difference that might be due to measurement error or to examiner, for example. It's a real difference. So it's a statistically significant difference. But sometimes you have differences that are statistically significant that are not necessarily meaningful clinically. So in order to determine whether or not that statistically significant difference is clinically meaningful, you want to look at the frequency with which that difference score occurred in our normative sample. And you notice fewer than 5% of individuals this child's age in the normative sample had a difference score that large in that direction, so where receptive was higher than expressive. And certainly you can plot your profile here if you will. But what we know is that this is an unusual difference, and it's a difference that we certainly want to take into account when we consider making recommendations for treatment. So the next thing you want to think about is, well, why? Why did this student have such a large difference between recognition vocabulary and production vocabulary? And certainly, as we talked about, two of the hypotheses could be word finding difficulties, word retrieval difficulties, expressive difficulties. And if those are your hypotheses, or if you have other hypotheses, how would you confirm one or more of those hypotheses? How would you refute them? And certainly one of the things that you can do, and this is where I think the collaboration between the speech-language pathologist and the school psychologist is really helpful, because in this case, in fact, we do have information from the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, and what we noted there was that when we were asking the child open-ended questions, the child really struggled to provide responses, and struggled, we noticed, seemed like those word retrieval difficulties and expressive difficulties. So we believe we have some confirmation that that might be the issue. But in addition to the quantitative analysis, you also want to take a look at the qualitative analysis by looking at the crossover vocabulary, the words that are shared between PPVT-5 and EVT-3, and then also the item analysis. Did the child do better on home vocabulary compared to school vocabulary? Did the child perform better, for example, on nouns? What about the three-tier model of vocabulary, and what about STEM vocabulary? So if you're using the Q Global Scoring Program, you will be able to get all of this information. If you're using the paper version, certainly you can use the tables in the manual to perform these qualitative analyses as well. But when you look at the crossover vocabulary, you would have a word here, and it would be listed right here, that is shared conceptually between PPVT-5 and EVT-3. And you could see if the child got both of those responses correct or incorrect. Notice the plus would indicate that the response was correct on both, and then you have a number of them where the response was incorrect on both. And certainly that will allow you to get some information about whether it's the word or whether it is the demand of the task. So if the child, for example, right here, she got this one right on the PPVT-5 and not on the EVT-3, what is it? What is unique in terms of the characteristics of the EVT-3 versus the PPVT-5, and it might be whatever that unique or those unique characteristics are that might explain the differential performance when we look at the crossover vocabulary. And then when we look at home versus school vocabulary, you'll notice here in terms of the percent correct that this student's percent correct was consistent for school vocabulary and home vocabulary. But when we look at nouns, verbs, and attributes, notice that for verbs on EVT-3, percent correct was 67. Attributes, adjectives, and adverbs, notice percent correct again 67. So she's doing well, not okay, but she's doing better on nouns. She's doing better on verbs in the receptive mode compared to the expressive mode. And then when we look at the 3-tier model, you notice that she does better on Tier 1 words, which are words that are typically learned in the home environment. When children enter school, they typically know those Tier 1 words compared to Tier 2 and Tier 3 words. So again, when you think about what this means in terms of intervention, and the other one is going to be STEM words, which is new to PPVT-5 and EVT-3, notice that she got more STEM words correct in the recognition format versus the expressive format. So what are some of the interventions that we would suggest? And again, the Q Global program will suggest some interventions for you. Certainly cooperative learning, peer tutoring, robust vocabulary instruction. I think making sure that students learn to be curious about words they don't know. They learn to notice words in their environments. Semantic mapping, prefix instruction, morphemic analysis. Morphemic analysis, I think, has a lot to do with word families that I mentioned before. So, for example, one of the things that I like to do with children is to think about a root word and then think about adding morphemes to that root word, and then asking them to think, are these considered to be true suffixes, for example, right? Is the ER a true suffix? Is the ING a true suffix? Is the in up here a true suffix? So again, to get children to start thinking about morphology, you're thinking about root words and prefixes and suffixes. And certainly the other thing that might be helpful for you when you think about interventions would be the Bridge of Vocabulary 2 that provides these explicit research-based vocabulary intervention activities. Okay. So I think what we wanted to accomplish, and I hope we did, is to be able to list 3 reasons for assessing vocabulary. Certainly it can help us if the referral is related to a language disorder. It contributes valuable information to that process. Helps us to identify students who might be at risk for reading difficulties. It helps us certainly to identify and compare production vocabulary to recognition vocabulary. I think for comparing those 2, we talked about looking at development, looking at the vocabulary development of bilingual students, breadth and depth of vocabulary, homeschool vocabulary, and so on. And then certainly I think the qualitative analysis is what's going to help you to connect your assessment results to your interventions. Okay. Now I did say that we were going to leave 10 minutes at the end, and clearly I've exceeded that, so I apologize that I'm a little over time here. But I know that my colleagues, including Nancy Castilleja, was able to respond to some of those, and I think she's going to want to remind us a little bit. I think I included this in your handout, the link to that webinar we presented in September.
And for those of you who had questions about the instructions for submitting the forms, if you have a handout, it should be in your handout as the last slide. If you don't have a handout yet, email Sherry at Sherry, SHERRY.Locken, LOKKEN, @pearson.com, and she'll send it to you, and the instructions for submitting CEUs will be in your handout. The forms have to be postmarked no later than October 17th to Darlene Davis to be submitted for CEU credit to ASHA, assuming that you've met the criteria of attending the entire session and submitting the forms. Thanks for joining us today. We'll leave this up here, maybe another, let's go back, Sherry, or Gloria, sorry. If we can leave this up here, and that last slide that Gloria was moving to has her contact information if you have additional questions. So you'll have that in your handout as well. Thanks for joining us today, and we hope to see you at the next webinar.